All right, so it's less windy out today, so I'm going to try and read again outside. Unlike chapter 5 and 6, hopefully there'll be less ambient noise. But I like to sit outside, and it's nice out, and it's supposed to rain later today and thunderstorm tomorrow, so I want to get as much outside time as I can. So hopefully this will be better. Chapter 7. It felt strange to be leaving the castle after all these years. Will turned back at the bottom of the hill, his small bundle of belongings slung over his shoulder, and stared up at the massive walls. Castle Redmont dominated the landscape. Built on top of a small hill, it was a massive three-sided structure, facing roughly west and with a tower at each of the three corners. In the center, protected by the three curtain walls, were the castle yard and the keep, a fourth tower that soared above the others and housed the Baron's official quarters and his private living apartments, along with those of his senior officers. The castle was built in ironstone, a rock that was almost indestructible, and in the low sun of early morning or late afternoon seemed to glow with an inner red light. It was this characteristic that gave the castle its name, Redmont, or Red Mountain. At the foot of the hill, and on the other side of the Tarbis River, lay Wensley Village, a cheerfully haphazard cluster of houses with an inn and those craft shops necessary to meet the day's demands of day-to-day country life: a cooper, wheelwright, smithy, and harness maker. Let's take a look at these for just a second before we go on. A cooper is someone who makes wooden casks, that you keep beverages in, or horse troughs, or barrels, anything of wood. A wheelwright would be someone who made wheels, of course. A smithy is a blacksmith. So that's the person who most works with metal, putting shoes on horses and making tools. And a harness maker is someone who makes a harness, for example, for horses. So that's what those are. The land around had been cleared for some distance, both to provide farmlands for the villagers to tend and to prevent enemies from being able to approach unseen. In times of danger, the villagers would drive their flocks across the wooden bridge that spanned the Tarbis, removing the center span behind them, and seek shelter behind the massive ironstone walls of the castle, protected by the Baron's soldiers and the knights trained in Redmont's battle school. So something like this. Visualize this when you're picturing Redmont, except for there's no keep in this one. All the towers are pretty even. So you have some kind of protection. In this one, it's a moat. In other ones, it's walls, high walls that protect. And then you bring your animals and your people through here, and then you put the drawbridge down. Redmont doesn't mention a moat. It talks about the wall. So you bring people in, and then there are people up on the wall, soldiers on the wall, to defend it from attackers. So you'd bring people into the walled kind of city. So there'd be little villages and people living outside of the wall doing things for the whole community. And then if there was imminent attack, then everyone would come into the wall to be protected. All right, so hopefully you can visualize that a little bit more now. So let's keep going. Halt's cottage lay some distance away from both castle and village, nestling under the shelter of the trees at the edge of the forest. The sun was just rising over the trees as Will made his way to the log cabin. A thin spiral of smoke was rising from the chimney, so Will reasoned that Halt was already up and about. He stepped up onto the veranda that ran the length of one side of the house, hesitated for a moment, then, taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly on the door. "Come in." said a voice from inside. Will opened the door and went into the cottage. It was small, but surprisingly neat and comfortable looking inside. He found himself in the main room, a combined living and dining area, with a small kitchen at one end, separated from the main area by a pine bench. There were comfortable chairs ranged around a fire, a well-scrubbed wooden table, and pots and pans that gleamed from much polishing. There was even a vase of brightly colored wildflowers on the mantel shelf, and the early morning sun streamed cheerfully through a large window. 2 other rooms led off the main room. Halt sat in one of the chairs, his booted feet resting on the table. "At least you're on time," he said gruffly. "Have you had your breakfast yet?" "Yes, sir," said Will, staring in fascination at the ranger. This was the first time he had ever seen Halt without his gray-green cloak and hood. The ranger was wearing simple brown and gray woolen clothes and soft-looking leather boots. He was older than Will had realized. His hair and beard were short and dark, but peppered with steel gray flecks. They were both roughly trimmed, and Will thought they looked as if Halt had cut himself with his hunting knife. The ranger stood up. He was surprisingly small in build. That was something else that Will had never realized. The gray cloak had concealed a lot about Halt. He was slim and not at all tall. In fact, he was considerably shorter than average height. But there was a sense of power and whipcord strength about him, so that his lack of height and bulk didn't make him any less daunting a figure. "Finished staring?" asked the ranger suddenly. Will jumped nervously. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," he said. Will grunted. He pointed to one of the small rooms Will had noticed as he entered. "That'll be your room. You can put your things in there." He moved away to the wood stove in the kitchen area, and Will hesitantly entered the room he had indicated. It was small, but, like the rest of the cottage, it was also clean and comfortable looking. A small bed lay alongside one wall. There was a wardrobe for clothes and a rough table with a washing basin and jug on it. There was also, Will noticed, another vase of freshly picked wildflowers, adding a bright spot of color to the room. He put his small bundle of clothes and belongings on the bed and went back into the main room. Halt was still busy by the stove, his back to Will. Will coughed apologetically to attract his attention. Halt continued to stir coffee into a pot on the stove. Will coughed again. "Got a cold, boy?" asked the ranger without turning around. No, sir." "Then why are you coughing?" asked Halt, turning around to face him. Will hesitated. "Well, sir," he began uncertainly, "I just wanted to ask you, what does a ranger actually do?" "He doesn't ask pointless questions, boy. He keeps his eyes and ears open, and he looks and listens, and eventually, if he hasn't got too much cotton wool between his ears, he learns." "Oh," said Will. "I see." He didn't, and even though he realized that this was probably no time to ask more questions, he couldn't help himself, repeating a little rebelliously, "I just wondered what rangers do is all." Hall caught the tone in his voice and turned to him, a strange gleam in his eye. "Well then, I suppose I'd better tell you," he said. "What rangers do, or more correctly, what rangers' apprentices do, is the housework." Will had a sinking feeling as the suspicion struck him that he'd made a tactical error. "The housework?" he repeated. Halt nodded, looking distinctly pleased with himself. "That's right. Take a look around." He paused, gesturing around the interior of the cabin for Will to do as he suggested, then continued. See any servants? No, sir, Will said slowly. No, sir, indeed, Halt said, because this isn't a mighty castle with a staff of servants. This is a lowly cabin, and it has water to be fetched, and firewood to be chopped, and floors to be swept, and rugs to be beaten. And who do you suppose might do all those things, boy? Will tried to think of some answer other than the one which now seemed inevitable. Nothing came to mind, so he finally said in a defeated tone, Would that be me, sir? I believe it would be, the ranger told him, then rattled off a list of instructions crisply. Bucket there, barrel outside the door, water in the river, axe in the lean-to, firewood behind the cabin, broom by the door, and I believe you can probably see where the floor might be. Yes, sir, said Will, beginning to roll up his sleeves. He'd noticed the water barrel as he approached, obviously holding the day's water supply for the cabin. He estimated that it would hold 20 or 30 buckets full. With a sigh, he realized he was going to have a busy morning. As he walked outside, the empty bucket in one hand, he heard the ranger say contentedly as he poured himself a mug of coffee and sat down again, I'd forgotten how much fun having an apprentice can be. Will couldn't believe that such a small and seemingly neat cottage could generate so much cleaning and general maintenance. After he had filled the water barrel with fresh river water, 31 buckets full, he chopped wood from a stack of logs behind the cabin, piling the split firewood into a neat stack. He swept out the cabin, then, after Halt decided that the rug on the living room floor needed beating, he rolled it up, carried it outside, and draped it over a rope slung between two trees, beating it savagely so that clouds of dust flew from it. From time to time, Halt leaned out the window to give him encouragement, which usually consisted of curt comments such as, "You missed a bit on the left side," or "Put some energy into it, boy." When the rug had been replaced on the floor, Halt decided that several of his cooking pots didn't gleam with sufficient intensity. "We'll have to give them a bit of a scouring," he said, more or less to himself. Will knew by now that this translated to, "You'll have to give them a bit of a scouring." So without a word, he took the pots to the river's edge and half filled them with water and fine sand, scouring and polishing the metal till it gleamed. Halt, meanwhile, had moved to a canvas chair on the veranda, where he sat reading through a tall pile of what looked to be official communications. Passing by once or twice, Will noticed that several of the papers bore crests and coats of arms, while the vast majority were headed with a simple oak leaf design. When Will returned from the river bank, he held the pots up for Halt's inspection. The ranger grimaced at his distorted reflection in the bright copper surface. Not bad. Can see my own face in it," he said, then added, without a hint of a smile, "May not be such a good thing." Will said nothing. With anyone else, he might have suspected it was a joke, but with Halt, you simply couldn't tell. Halt studied him for a second or two. Then his shoulders lifted slightly in a shrug, and he gestured for Will to return the pots to the kitchen. Will was halfway through the door when he heard Halt behind him say, That's odd." Thinking the ranger might be talking to him, Will paused at the door. "I beg your pardon?" he asked suspiciously. Each time Halt had found a new chore for him to attend to, he had seemed to begin the instruction with a statement like, "How unusual! The living room rug is full of dust," or, "I do believe the stove is in dire need of a new supply of firewood." It was an affectation that Will had found more than a little annoying over the day, although Halt seemed to be quite fond of it. This time, however, it seemed that he had been genuinely musing to himself as he read through a new report, one of the oak leaf crested ones, Will noted. Now the ranger looked up, a little surprised that Will had addressed him. "What's that?" he said. Will shrugged. "Sorry. When you said 'that's odd,' I thought you were talking to me." Halt shook his head several times, still frowning at the report in his hand. No, he said, a trifle distractedly. "I was just reading this." His voice trailed away, and he frowned thoughtfully. Will, his curiosity roused, waited expectantly. "What is it?" he finally ventured to ask. As the ranger turned those dark eyes on him, he instantly wished he hadn't. Halt regarded him for a second or two. "Curious, are you?" he said at length. And when Will nodded uncomfortably, he went on in an unexpectedly milder tone. "Well, I suppose that's a good trait for a ranger's apprentice. After all, that's why we tested you with that paper in the Baron's office." "You tested me?" Will set the heavy copper kettle down by the door. "You expected me to try to see what it said?" Halt nodded. "Would have been disappointed if you hadn't. Also, I wanted to see how you'd go about it." Then he held up a hand to forestall the torrent of questions that were about to tumble out of Will's mouth. "We'll discuss that later," he said, glancing meaningfully at the kettle and the other pots. Will stooped to retrieve them and turned back to the house once more. But curiosity still burned in him, and he turned to the ranger again. "So, what does it say?" he asked, nodding toward the report. Again there was a silence as Halt regarded him, perhaps assessing him. Then he said, "Lord Northolt is dead. Apparently killed by a bear last week while out hunting." "Lord Northolt?" Will asked. The name was vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't place it. "Former Supreme Commander of the King's Army," Halt told him. And Will nodded, as if he had known this. But since Halt seemed to be answering his questions, he was emboldened to continue. "What's so odd about it? After all, bears do kill people from time to time." Halt nodded. "True. But I would have thought Cordham Fief was a little far west for bears. And I would have thought Northolt was too experienced a hunter to go after one alone." He shrugged as if dismissing the thought. But then again, life is full of surprises and people do make mistakes. He gestured toward the kitchen again, indicating that the conversation was over. "When you've put those away, you might like to clean out the fireplace," he said. Will moved to do as he was told, but a few minutes later, as he walked past one of the windows to the large fireplace that took up most of one wall in the living room, he glanced out to see the ranger tapping the report thoughtfully on his chin, his thoughts obviously a long way away. In this chapter, they mentioned of coat of arms, and this is what they're talking about when they say coat of arms. There's these medieval shields, and they have different colors and different designs on them, and families had their own coat of arms, and people who trace their ancestry back can look up what their coat of arms was. You have Irish coat of arms and Scottish coat of arms and Britain coat of arms, mostly European. This was a European thing. You can see here from Encyclopedia Britannica that it was a hereditary symbol dating back to early medieval Europe, used to establish identity in battle. It gave family descent, property ownership, and eventually profession. This was the Royal Arms of the United Kingdom. Identifies them as representing Queen Elizabeth II in this one. And you can look up and find out all sorts of more information. It also identified the knight in the social surroundings of the tournament. Had a lot of different purposes. The oak leaf in this book is a major symbol for rangers, and it's actually still used today in the military in the United States. Pretty sure it's the Army that uses it. The oak leaf has long been a symbol of strength and endurance and honor and virtue. Kind of the oak tree is the king of trees, like the lion is the king of the animals. So the oak leaf is going to be an important symbol. There's a picture here that's used on one of the books, and the oak leaf holding the cloak together. All right, so that is it for this chapter, and next will be chapter 8.